Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture for this week. This lecture will be focusing on interest groups in the kind of a similar way that we were talking about political parties, thinking about what do they do, how are they different than political parties, what types of collective action problems they solve, how do they exercise power, how do they try to influence politics, and then we'll also talk a little bit about how are they regulated or not regulated. So what is an interest group? Well, your textbook defines an interest group is an organization with the goal of influencing decision-making and public policy. We actually have a lot of different types of groups. We have membership groups. These are types of organizations where individuals join voluntarily, they pay dues or they get donations. They're people who have common issues or concerns and want to be with others who share their views. Organizations like the NRA, the NRDC, other kind of issues where people join. There are also in-house or contract lobbyist groups that are lobbyists or that will represent specific companies or industries, or they get contracted with. This is more like the American Petroleum Institute, or like you will have lobbyists that get hired by a company that wants to try to influence a piece of legislation. You also have legislative liaisons, executive organizations or municipalities. So like you have legislative liaisons in executive agencies like the EPA that want to go and try to influence policy passed by Congress, but also by like state and local governments will try to influence policy. You have trade associations. These include kind of various industry groups. This is more like the American Petroleum Institute, actually, that will kind of work together in the same organization or industry with similar concerns, right? American Petroleum Institute, the American Beverages Association, and also we can think of hobbyists, people who take action, try to influence policy about issues that they care about, not necessarily in a formal group. So how will these distinguish between political parties? Well, on the one hand, parties nominate candidates, organize elected officials, and write platforms. Where interest groups, they lobby elected officials. They don't select candidates themselves. They try to lobby elected officials. They also provide rewards to members, whether that's some sort of like swag or like the promise of legislation that will benefit you. But all of them are trying to mobilize and organize political participation. They provide heuristics to simplify voting decisions in the public by like endorsing candidates or nominating for interest groups or nominating candidates for parties. They also provide funding for political campaigns. So what is lobbying? A lobbyist is someone who represents the interest organization before government and is usually paid for doing so. And because they are paid, there are laws that require, notably the Lobbying Disclosure Act, that that you have to be registered with the government that you are lobbying. Usually when we think about lobbying, we think about at the federal level, but there's actually a growing avenue for lobbying at the state level. States have much more diverse and varied regulations about lobbyists, so many groups have found it easier to try to lobby for change in legislation at the state level. State legislatures also tend to be less professionalized, and therefore sometimes easier to lobby and influence. But because of this, it's actually hard to know what the total number of lobbyists are in the country. So just as we talked about parties as kind of rational responses to certain collective action problems, we can also think of interest groups in the same way. So how do they solve these collective action problems? One way is to lower the opportunity costs of political participation. That they provide material benefits, tangible benefits of giving money to, like joining the AARP and paying dues that lobbying organization then uses to kind of influence policy. But you get something out of it, right? You get your AARP member advantages card, right? But you can also get non-material benefits, the solidarity of working with other people who care about the same issue, or like the promise of actually achieving the goal more effectively. Whoops, there's a typo here. There's also the idea of disturbance theory, that interest groups provide a means of responding to key events or shifts, that there's a way for this is the example, we can think of the March for Our Lives movement after the failure of gun regulations and the shooting in Florida, in Parkland, Florida, at a school, that you can mobilize in the public in response to key events kind of faster than the political parties can shift. And parties work to provide connections between individuals and government. But there's a channel for political participation. They provide instructions and coordinate collective action. They pool money, and they lower the information costs, right? An organization can say like, oh, we want all of our members to call their members of Congress about this issue, that they can kind of simplify the possibility of political participation, or just like, give us your money and we'll do the hard work for you, right? They can also work to mobilize and activate political participation through framing or advertising. They try to mobilize people to vote in particular ways, or mobilize people to get out in the streets or what have you. And so there's lots of different ways that interest groups can try to organize people to act differently. But the key idea is that they're trying to lower the opportunity costs and the information costs for political action, even if by lowering the opportunity cost to basically say like, hand us the money and we'll take it from here. You don't have to do anything else, right? Or like, you don't have to call your senators. If you kind of like join our organization, we'll lobby your senators on your behalf. And we'll say like, look, on behalf of our 300,000 members around the country, we think you should do this, rather than all 300,000 of them individually calling their senators or representatives. So let's think back to our three faces of power in our discussion of pluralism and elitism, and thinking about like, how do interest groups actually fit into this? So if you remember, right, Dahl's pluralist theory's key idea is that people form interest groups in order to influence the behavior of elected officials. And that means that like people have the ability to influence politics, right? And so we have individual voters that elect members of Congress, presidents, members of the state legislatures, governors, etc. And then we also have interest groups and lobbyists that also are trying to influence the actions of government. So what resources can lobbyists use to exert power over congressional decision-making? Well, they can try to influence elections. They can rank and endorse candidates. They can, say like when the NRA gives candidates like an A+ or an F rating to their members, they're kind of making it easier for people to vote. They can fund political action committees and super PACs to fund either directly fund campaigns or provide soft money to issue areas that are like not technically funding campaigns, but still really actually funding campaigns. Or they can try to directly persuade lawmakers. They can go and they can provide information. They can say like, look, our organization has done a lot of research on this area. Here's what the best policy option would be. They can also write model legislation. There's actually research that's found in like especially at the state level where legislatures are less professionalized, that a lot of legislation that gets passed is actually written by interest groups and lobbyists. That they go and they give it to a member of the state legislature and they just basically submit it as written to the floor. And so it's actually these interest groups that are writing legislation. And they can also promise electoral contributions, right? If you vote against this bill, we can, make sure that we can give you lots of money for your next campaign. So often they're targeting specific lawmakers on specific committees, but they can also try to influence executive agencies. And when we talk about in a few weeks the kind of federal bureaucracy, one thing that lobbyists can try to do is, rather than affecting how the law gets written, they can try to lobby the people who enforce that law and affect how strictly or how leniently that law gets enforced. They also can try to lobby the judicial branch of government. They can try, like you can think of things like groups like the Federalist Society that try to lobby the president and members of Congress for particular appointees to the federal judiciary. And they also, various groups like the ACLU, the NRDC, Planned Parenthood, the NAACP, they write briefs or they in defense of different cases, or they represent clients suing all the way up to the Supreme Court over different issues. So they can try to influence politics in lots of different ways. So according to pluralist theory, right, interest groups try to mobilize both like financial resources and information resources and electoral resources to try to influence public policy. And this is the first phase of power, trying to mobilize interest, influence over a given outcome. And whichever group is able to mobilize the most resources, they'll see those interests realized in public policy, right? So this is this kind of classic pluralist model. I've simplified the graphic a little bit here, right? The idea is that the people organize into interest groups. These interest groups try to help fund campaigns to organize voters. They try to directly lobby the formal decision-making body, Congress, State House, et cetera, to choose issue A or issue B. And whoever can mobilize the most resources wins. So what about the other phases of power? Do interest groups kind of intersect there? Well, your reading from E. Schattschneider suggests, the semi-separate people suggest that they do. Schattschneider argues the pluralist model is too simplistic, and that it assumes that the decision-making arena, what he calls the pressure system in your reading, is equally open to all and kind of functions like a physics equation, that you just put like more influence on the left side of the equation, and that means to an outcome on the right side of the equation. But instead, he wants us to think of interest groups themselves as a way of mobilizing bias. The interest groups aren't just simply these neutral mobilization of resources in the first phase of power, but are themselves creating the second phase of power, this non-decisional power, this exclusion of issues from the area. And they do this in a couple of ways. The first is that they can exclude membership to their group. Interest groups disproportionately represent wealthy and business interests. And if you think back to the article from Gillens and Page that I referenced back in week 2, that this has been kind of maintained throughout more recent scholarship, that the interest groups don't tend to represent the average person, but the wealthy and business interests where the money is. And he writes in the famous quote from the text, "The flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper class accent. Probably about 90% of the people cannot get into the pressure system." That if lobbying and interest groups are how people are supposed to access government, right? If most of these interest groups are collecting dues or collecting money from corporations or businesses or wealthy people, then the average person isn't going to gain that same type of access. They're going to be excluded from decision-making power, that non-decisional power. Interest groups, he also argues, work to privatize conflict. And what he means in the reading here is that they try to resolve issues before they kind of get up, right? That when you have interest groups kind of writing model legislation and kind of channeling, this is the kind of critique of like the corporate interest group by many kind of like more radical groups on both the left and right, that they like take like a lot of like discontent about an issue and then they translate it into a much more narrower set of issues. They prevent conflict from going to the public by saying, don't worry, we'll take care of it. We're going to do all the lobbying. We're going to do the pressure. And that keeps the kind of the stakes of the political conflict narrower. And as Schattschneider writes, the dominant business interests resist appeals to the government. The most powerful special interests want private settlements because they're able to dictate the outcome as long as the conflict remains private. So rather than going, the business interests and other interest groups try to prevent they try to settle things with private lawsuits or private settlements rather than the people actually mobilizing and trying to influence political actions. So we get this mobilization of bias, the interest group membership exclusions, right? This kind of wealth and elitism, and this kind of work to prevent issues from even getting raised in politics in the first place. So you already have interest groups kind of functioning both in this pluralist model, but also to kind of exclude the people from fully participating. And that it's actually this mix of only that which gets through this mobilization of bias that actually influences the formal decision-making power. And so we should think of what interest groups are doing as much closer to a mix between the first and second phase of power, rather than in Dahl's model, this kind of direct influence. But your reading from Lacombe also suggests that we should think of interest groups in the third phase of power, though he doesn't use that language. He's talking about the way in which he's focusing on the National Rifle Association, tries to influence policy not simply by mobilizing resources, but by trying to activate a certain polarized social identity and mobilizing people through social cues. As he writes, the NRA developed a social identity for gun owners and then mobilized this group into politics by framing gun regulations as a threat to gun owners' lifestyles, values, and traditions, and affront to gun owners and their very identities. that it's not just simply about trying to mobilize donations or voters, but that there's a prior thing happening, this ideological power in which they're trying to actually cultivate a certain sense of values and culture and social identity, such that any sort of gun regulation, no matter how simple, is perceived as a threat to that identity. And that's going to then lead to downstream the mobilization of greater resources, right? So as much as we think of the people forming interest groups, we should also think of interest groups kind of cultivating the identity and the ideology of the people, that there's this kind of additional layer here shaping what issues are even considered and organized as interest groups try to cultivate these particular identities. So we get a much more kind of complex vision of like what is actually influencing public policy than the simple pluralist model would have given us, even though the whole point of like the whole kind of takeaway from the pluralist model is that like interest groups represent people form interest groups to influence public policy by mobilizing resources. So how do we regulate interest groups? Well, the challenge here is that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech and assembly, and that creates an implicit right to form associations and participate in interest groups. And like what the question then becomes is what counts as speech and assembly? Because you wouldn't, there's nothing like your political speech is protected. You should have the right to petition your government and try to influence public policy. So why can't you get together with a bunch of your friends and try to mobilize pressure as a group? Well, in 1971, the Federal Election Campaigns Act tried to limit some of this question by limiting contributions to one's own federal campaign as a candidate, and amendments to this law in 1974 prohibited the transfer of interest group money to political parties. So interest groups could not directly fund political parties. However, in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled in Buckley versus Vallejo that Congress can regulate contributions, but not the candidate's own contributions and not overall spending limits. And the key idea here in this case is this is where we get the origin of the idea that money is a form of political speech. Part of the opinion reads, a restriction on the amount of money a person or group can spend on political communication during a campaign necessarily reduces the quantity of expression, and by restricting the number of issues discussed, the depth of their exploration and the size of the audience reached. That limiting money ultimately is limiting speech. You're limiting the amount of political speech that's happening, and therefore we cannot have overall spending limits by individuals and groups on political campaigns. Now, there were certain regulations that were made, but then groups started exploring the opportunities of soft money that allowed interest groups to exceed spending limits by not donating to specific candidates, but running their own kind of ads on particular issues, right? So you wouldn't have the money, you wouldn't give the money directly, raise money and give it directly to your preferred candidate, but you would raise that money and you would send out mailers and buy TV ads that weren't directly endorsing that candidate, but maybe they talked about how the opposing candidate was really bad for schools or for the environment or for jobs, and it was like Americans for more jobs or Americans for better schools, right? So it's not like endorsing the candidate, but it's effectively doing that. In 2002, Russ Feingold and John McCain, Democrat and Republican, worked together to pass the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act that limited parties' ability to raise and spend soft money. But then the Supreme Court came along and in Citizens United versus FEC overturned these soft money bans and expanded, crucially, Buckley versus Vallejo's logic that money equals speech to corporate persons. This wasn't just protecting the speech of individuals to donate, but for corporation, this is the corporations are people too logic, that corporate persons have freedom of speech in terms of campaign finance. Then in 2014, in the case McCutcheon versus FEC, the Supreme Court overturned aggregate spending limits on campaigns as protected speech, so that you could not have like overall limits on the amount of spending that campaigns did with the same Buckley versus Vallejo logic. So you have this kind of erosion of regulations in the name of protection of political speech. Now, when we're talking about lobbyists themselves, not just interest groups donating to political campaigns, there's also other sets of regulations. As we've already talked about, lobbyists have to be registered and disclosed. And in 2007, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act required more detailed disclosure of the activities all the lobbyists are engaging in. There's also prohibitions on directly giving gifts to elected officials. You cannot bribe an elected official. You can't just say like, if you do this, I will give you, this house in the Hamptons or something like that. There are also revolving door laws. These are usually executive regulations. I just heard on the radio that Biden administration has instituted fairly strict revolving door laws. And these are time limits on joining a lobbying firm or becoming a lobbyist after serving in government, so that you don't just have people basically selling their access and their influence as former members of the of the State Department or the FEC or whatever to lobbying firms, and then and then going back into government later, and then being in charge of regulating the industries that they used to work in, and contribution disclosures. So political campaigns and candidates have to disclose where they got their money from, and the idea here is that if people know what groups are backing their these candidates, that might create a kind of check that against things, right? Like if I'm running for like healthcare reform, and then it's revealed that I'm getting a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry, for example, or the insurance industry, that people might doubt the seriousness of my credentials of healthcare reform, and that provides greater transparency. So we'll talk a little bit more about power and collective action and organization in this week's discussion section. Next week, we're going to be turning to elections, campaigns, and the media, looking at kind of political campaigns, elections, voting, and the way that the media can influence this, and moving from there. And the minute paper question for this week, again, you can go to bit.ly/P lowercase OLS 101 M P and answer the question. What are some ways that interest groups and political parties solve collective action problems? As always, any questions that you have about this lecture or the assigned reading, go ahead and ask it and in the little box there, and we will take those issues up in discussion section. So that is it for this week's lectures. I will see you in discussion section. Until then, take care.